Welcome. I hope everybody's doing really well. Really pleased that you're able to join us for the third in our series of employment law webinars. This one, as the title slide suggests, on redundancy and restructuring, a really important topic at the minute. For those that don't know me, I'm Nick Elliott. I head the Employment and Dispute Resolution group at Actons. Actons are a firm of solicitors based in Nottingham, servicing clients across the UK, but primarily out of the East Midlands due to our location. So clients like Waterstones, Staffline and Iceland Supermarkets, the kind of names that you might have heard of, as well as a lot of different SME clients. That tends to be our main focus, SME clients across the East Midlands and beyond. In terms of housekeeping for this morning, we have a chat function as part of Teams, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. If there are any technical issues, please pop those into the chat, and Matt, who's making all of this work in the background, will try and help with those. If you have any questions, we have the Q&A section. Again, pop those in as we go. I know James and Laura have a section for questions at the end. If they are able to multitask, they might even pick them up as they go. Who knows, we'll see, but there will be time for questions there. It's a fairly interactive session, so we have got some polling and some breakout rooms, so that will keep it interesting. In terms of other housekeeping, if you hear a fire alarm, the chances are that's in either your house or your office, and you should take notice of that, I would suggest. So without further ado, I'm getting off lightly today. I'm not presenting other than the intro. I'll hand you over to James and Laura, who are going to take you through the session. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Nick. Good morning, everyone. And today's topic is broadly put about managing change. And I'm sure you've all had various challenges, I say post-COVID, if that's really a true thing, but certainly during the roller coaster that was the COVID period, from furlough to the aftermath of furlough to the new normal. And my sense, speaking to employers, is that the last few months in this new financial year since April have been about reassessing, and that's led some people to think about, well, do we need to change because we're back to the new normal? We've had a good few months of that. How is our organisation? Do we need to do anything to optimise it? Which leads on to this session today. Obviously, there's lots of other things you could be doing, but today we're going to focus on redundancies and restructuring. So this slide really just sets out an overview of the topics. We're going to start off with redundancies. The logical place to start is, what is redundancy? Then the next one is really just how to get it right. If we're going to dismiss people for redundancy, how do we do it fairly? Then we'll move on to things that are not quite redundancy, but are similar: restructuring, making changes, usually to terms and conditions, to try and make an organisation more optimally run or more efficiently run. How do we go about doing that? And then very briefly at the end, I'm going to touch on collective consultation obligations, more in the context of planning a restructure or a redundancy exercise, because those of you who've done a collective consultation exercise will know there are a number of procedural steps to go through, and that could form the content of a whole new seminar. So I won't talk about that for ages, but it's worth bearing in mind if you're in the planning stages or you're thinking about going through a form of restructuring. So, as I said, start with redundancies. What is a redundancy situation? Well, redundancy is defined by statute. The statutory definition is quite wordy. So on the slide, we've broken it down into a kind of broad categories of redundancy situation that fall within the statutory definition. The first is the most obvious: a business closes, the staff are redundant. The second one relates to place of work. So if a workplace but not a business closes, then those workers at the workplace that closes are potentially redundant. And then finally, the widest bit, a redundancy situation is where an employer has a reduced requirement for employees to do work of a particular kind. And that can be the type of work or the location of the work. It's not always easy to establish whether there is or isn't a redundancy situation. So to help us navigate this definition, we have some polling. So fingers at the ready. the first poll of the morning. We're always employer A in these examples. East Midlands employer, they have an office in Derby and another in Nottingham. They propose to relocate their engineering department and the 3 people within that department from Derby to Nottingham. Does employer A have a redundancy situation? Hopefully you can cast your votes now. Oh, more and more people are voting. The bars are moving. Yes had a strong lead, but then was pegged back to a marginal lead. I would say, and these aren't from cases, so this is just me applying the definition and giving you my opinion rather than being a decided case, but I'm confident this is a redundancy situation based on the aspect of the definition of location. This employer has no ongoing requirement for engineers let me just check the facts, which way around was it? They want to relocate them within that from Derby, so they don't have a requirement anymore in Derby. So there's a locational requirement for engineering workers that's gone from Derby, and the fact that they might have vacancies in Nottingham doesn't change the fact that the Derby workers are potentially redundant. Gets trickier. Employer A this time makes doorknobs. They've had a boom in sales, so it's a very positive scenario, this one, and they're going to be operating 24 hours a day instead of the current 12. And they're going to have to move around the shifts to accommodate 24-hour working. So instead of having their day shifts, which operate 8 till 6, they're going to have 3 shift patterns, 12 till 8, 8 till 4, 4 till 12. And to cover all this time, they're actually going to have to recruit more people. But some of the people doing 8 till 6 say they can't do any of the 3 new shift patterns. And in the hypothetical scenario that these 8 till 6 people, some of them might have to be dismissed because they couldn't do any of the other 3 shifts that were introduced. My question is, did employer A have a redundancy situation? And if so, were the people who were on the 8 till 6 but couldn't agree to any of the other shifts, were they redundant? Vote now. Yeah, a stronger view on this one for no. I thought this was harder than the first one, but more of you have got it right. So the reason it's no is because employer A doesn't have a reduced requirement for employees to work in their factory. They have an increased requirement, and the time at which they work is the problem, and which is why some of them had to be dismissed. But the reason for their dismissal wasn't because employer A had a diminished requirement for work. In fact, the opposite was true. So well done, those people. Third example of 4. This time, employer A has entered into an agreement to outsource its cleaning requirements to company B. They currently employ 1 full-time cleaner. Does employer A have a redundancy situation? Vote now. All the polls are, certainly the bars on my screen are swinging back and forth, but it's settling for a, if you factor in the not sures, and I voted not sure just to not swing the vote, no is got a clear lead, and no is correct. This was a bit of a sneaky trick that I pulled here, because a lot of you might have been thinking, well, isn't this a TUPE scenario? The answer to that is yes. So employer A still needs their cleaner, and then at the point it's outsourced, based on the limited facts that I've given you, I think it's fairly safe to assume that that employee would transfer to the cleaning company. So employer A never had a reduced requirement for the cleaner. They needed them right up until the point they transferred across. And then when they didn't need a cleaner, they didn't have a cleaner. So that was a bit of a trick, but well done, majority. And the last one, longer facts this time. Team employer A, again engineers. I don't know why I picked engineers. Employer A has a team of 4 engineers. It wants to reorganize and implement a new structure with 3 engineers and an engineering supervisor who doesn't actually do proper engineering, but has a purely executive role and reports to the board. Employer A considers that all 4 engineers are capable of performing the executive role. None of the engineers apply for the executive role, and a selection exercise picks 3 engineers from the pool of 4. The 4th engineer is offered the executive role, declines it, and it's dismissed. Was the dismissal of the 4th engineer by reason of redundancy? Vote now. Oh, it's the bars are moving. It's very, very tight. 26 responses in. I don't think anyone can swing it now. I don't think there's enough people left to vote that could move it away from yes. And yes is correct. The reason being is it goes back to the part of the definition of work of a particular kind. And the work of a particular kind in this case is actual engineering. So whilst they don't have a need to reduce headcount, they do have a need to reduce actual engineering jobs from 4 to 3. And the fact that they've created a different executive role doesn't change that. That is work of a different type. So whilst they might have had it gone how they probably hoped in this hypothetical example, one of them accepted the other role, not lost anyone to redundancy because the 4th engineer and none of the other engineers wanted to do the executive role. The one that was dismissed by reason of redundancy. So well done. I think that was a full house for the majority. Right, now we're going to talk about dismissing fairly for redundancy. As I said at the start, that's what we want to do. It's worth going back to basics with unfair dismissal. And if you face an unfair dismissal case, the burden is on you as the employer to establish a fair reason for dismissal before an employment tribunal. In these few slides, at least, that fair reason that we seek to rely on is redundancy, and we've just talked about what a redundancy situation is. That's usually the easy part. The second part of the unfair dismissal test is for the tribunal to decide whether dismissing for that reason redundancy was fair or unfair. Now, the case law have told us how they assess this question of fairness in the context of redundancy dismissal. And the case of Polke introduced 3 guidelines. You might have heard of Polke. It's relevant in a different couple of contexts. But in the redundancy context, it said that an employer will not normally act reasonably and therefore won't fairly dismiss someone unless it first warns and consults, adopts a fair basis on which to select for redundancy, and considers suitable alternative employment. So by warning and consulting, I'm talking about the proposed redundancies themselves, adopts a fair basis selection, that's identifying fair selection pools or a fair way to select employees from selection pools or selecting people for roles created as part of a restructure. And suitable alternative employment is the employer searching for it and offering it if it is available before making a decision on making an employee redundant. And as these are the 3 key parts of the test the employment tribunal applies, we're going to look at each one in turn in a bit more detail. I'm going to hand over to Laura now to talk about consultation.
Thanks, James. So good morning, everyone. Consultation. So this is a word that I'm sure we've all heard 1,000 times while we've been talking about redundancy and restructures. But this is really a bit of a back to basics on what is consultation, what are the different types of consultation, and how long should you be consulting for. So perhaps an obvious one, but consultation is a 2-way street. So it's a discussion. It's not just a tick box exercise. And that's really the one thing that you need to have in mind when you're approaching these things. There is obviously collective, individual, and both. And as James has said, James is going to cover collective in more detail at the end. But individual, it's very rare that there will ever be any sort of redundancy consultations where an individual consultation isn't done with your employees. And timing and length is really a how long is a piece of string type question. There is no set timing or length for most types of redundancy consultations. We would normally say that anything less than a couple of weeks is an unrealistic target. You'd probably be looking more at 3 to 4 weeks in terms of the time it takes to consult and get all of that sort of fair two-way conversation done. But of course, that depends on the number of employees you're consulting with, the topic you're consulting on, and how big the exercise is. So the consultation and what are you having these discussions on? So the first thing that you need to start with is the selection pools and the selection criteria. So it's one that sometimes gets missed, but having chats with your employees, or if you have a workforce that is unionised, the unions, about what the selection criteria is and how you've come to the selection pools. So having that two-way dialogue in this is how we have come up with the selection pools, this is where we put you in the selection pool, asking for feedback on that, and also explaining to people what the selection criteria is and how you're intending to mark them against it. And that really is the first step of that consultation. As with most things in a redundancy consultation, having an audit trail that says this is what we discussed and this is what we decided is helpful. So if you have employees that come back and say, on the selection criteria, have you considered scoring it this way because I'm concerned about? If you write that down and you can show that you've considered it and thought about it, that is likely to be helpful should it be challenged. The second one on the outcome of any selection exercises or application of the selection criteria. Now, this is the one that most of you will know as the individual consultation meeting where you run through the scores with the individual. So making sure that they've seen a copy of their scores, being prepared to explain to them why they've scored, what they've scored, asking them for any questions and taking on board anything that they want to raise or ask about that. And do they need to be provided with them? Then the answer to that is yes. We'd always recommend that the employee has seen the scores that they got, and usually it would be helpful for them to, at the very least, see the cut-off point. So by that I mean, if they've been scored in a pool of, say, 5 people, they know where the cut-off is between them being at risk of redundancy and them being safe in terms of the scores against the criteria. There are sometimes some questions on, do we need to give employees the scores for everybody else? And I understand that there are some concerns on that. My personal preference is that they get an anonymised version of the scores. So employee 1, employee 2, employee 3, what they scored against the selection criteria, what the total scores were, and where that cut-off point was for the people that are going to be safe from the redundancy consultations. And as consultation is going on, and this is at any point during the pools and the selection criteria discussions, it's really important to remember that two-way street and not to become defensive over why they've been scored the way they have or why they're in the pool that they are. Just give feedback as far as you can, and it is of course totally fine to take that away, go and speak to other people, look at any documents that they've asked you to look at, and then feedback after the meeting in a written form or whatever works for you. And then alternative employment, which James mentioned as part of the test. So providing sufficient information on the employment. Now that sometimes is done as a, here is a job list that we've got available. Have a look, see if there's anything that you like. What we would rather see is, here is the jobs that we've got available, particularly in things like restructures where you might be introducing a new role, explaining what the new role is, what it entails, what kind of skills the person would need to do that. So making sure that people understand what the alternative employment available to them is. And if you can match vacant roles with potentially redundant employees, that could be helpful. So you will know who is in your redundancy pool and what kind of skills and strengths they have. You will also be able to see what sort of jobs you've got available and start making those matches up and seeing if there's anything that could be helpful to you. And the bumping one, now I know that some of you are probably looking at this thinking, what on earth is bumping? It is basically a slang term for moving someone that is a potentially redundant employee, so employee A, and bumping out somebody who isn't in the redundancy pool, so employee B. Possibly the best way of explaining this is you've got somebody who is, say, very senior, employee A, comes to you as part of the consultation and says, actually, no, I think that I'd rather take a step back now. I'd rather have a bit less responsibility, a bit less office time. I'd quite like to just do a few days a week, right at the bottom of the chain. I'm going to do some admin jobs, and employee B in that role, you can take him out instead. Now, obviously, that's not a nice position for that person to be in, but if somebody comes and says to you, well, what about me bumping that person out? You should consider it. And that will be the kind of thing that you'd normally do when you're considering anybody for any role, weighing up what their strengths are, the pros and cons of doing that. And in this scenario, including things like the business reasons and thoughts behind that. So if your concern is that you're losing employee A, who is very well known in the business, very good in the business, and that might be helpful to keep him, then that might be one thing you think of. But on the other hand, is he likely to stay and then go in a few months because he's been reduced down to a role that isn't what his skills are for? So that's just something to have in mind. I'm going to pass back over to James.
So as Laura alluded to in the consultation section, in order for there to be a fair basis selection, you have to first identify what the selection pools are. And as Laura said, in a workforce with a recognised trade union or links to a trade union or some kind of internal works council, then it is the logical step to first discuss any pooling decisions with them before a final decision is taken. In a smaller workforce where that doesn't exist, then as Laura alluded to, you might want to consult with the workers directly affected on the pooling, having made some provisional thoughts. But how do we decide the pools? Well, I've put down on the slide some bullet points to focus on the things that you should be considering when pooling. So what type of work is it that's actually ceasing or diminishing? To what extent are employees doing similar work? Are their jobs interchangeable? Should the pool include a narrow pool, or should you widen it to people who could do interchangeable jobs? And what all the case law on redundancy generally says is that employers should be looking at what employees actually do day to day, and not necessarily what their job titles may say. They're more interested in the work that's being done than titles and job descriptions. Narrow pools of one, narrow pools and pools of one can often be attractive to employers because the fewer employees that are in the selection process or are at risk of redundancy, the lower the amount of reduction across the workforce, it might impact morale less. And there's always a balancing exercise there, to wanting to disrupt, but also wanting to ensure fairness. Now, the one positive from an employer's perspective here is there's quite a lot of scope for employers to decide a pool. So the way a tribunal would assess whether a pool is reasonable is they'd say, is this a reasonable way for the employer to have pooled their workforce? They won't say, and they're not allowed to say, is this the way that we, the employment tribunal, would have done it ourselves? That's overstepping the line of an employment tribunal. They just have to assess the reasonableness. So in many contexts where there are interchangeable roles, it may well be reasonable to pool it the narrow way and the wider way. And what's most important when an employer is deciding on which way they're going to pool it, whether it's the wider way or the narrow way, is to think about which way to do it. And then when they decide which way, have reasons why, legitimate business reasons, and wider disruption could be part of that thinking. You know, if we're impacting 3 people versus 13 people, there can be a strong argument there to say that they are in different roles. We need to, if we deal with those 3 people, it will stop wider disruption. So it's one of the factors that you can consider. And pools of one, sometimes people are a bit nervous of pools of one, but there is case law, case of Alvis Vickers, which says that a pool of one can be a fair way to select. Clearly, that's going to depend on the structure of the organisation. Usually would be where someone's in a standalone role. And one question I often get is, if you have a pool of one, do you need to adopt a selection process from within the pool? It obviously seems like a slightly strange question, but yes, no is the answer to that. Common sense says if there's only one person, if they're in a pool of one, you don't have to then select them from the pool. That would be an entirely artificial exercise. Selection criteria. So that's just a term for a method of selecting people from within selection pools. It's not the way you have to do it. And there's lots of ways you could select from potentially redundant employees in a pool. But selection criteria is quite a commonly used way and is one that's worth discussing. When you're designing selection criteria, the most important thing is that you design it focusing on what you want to retain. So what is the role? What skills do we need for the role? What attributes will be beneficial for this role? Because I always say to clients, if you're doing a redundancy selection exercise, if you don't get the best people at the end, you didn't design it well enough, or you didn't realize who the best people were before, and you do now. So in terms of not slipping up and facing challenges in an employment tribunal, some tips there. Ideally, the scoring should be measurable and capable of independent verification. So, for example, you commonly see the use of a selection criteria and people would put in things like absence record or performance. On absence record, it can be easy for somebody who's marking it in a broad brush way to say, oh, they had a lot of absence, so I gave them a low score, or they had middling absence, so I gave them a middle score. It's much better to have a much more systematic approach. X to Y number of days is a score of 1. The next band of number of days is a score of 2, a score of 3, so that whoever was doing it must, unless they made a genuine mistake, get to the same score. And if an employee challenged it, you could say, well, you had 6 days off in the calendar period, X to Y, which was the period under scrutiny, that equated to a 2. That should mitigate any argument and would mean that somebody else could verify it, and it would be easy for an employment tribunal to see how you got to that position. This leads into the second point. Are the criteria easily measured against HR records? And appraisals are a great trick. One of the great advantages of doing appraisals through the year is that you could use them through the years, or even more frequently than that, is so that you could use them as part of a redundancy selection exercise. So if an employee says, why did I score well for performance? You could say, oh, we based it on the last appraisal, the last 2 appraisals. Again, it's going to be very difficult for an employee to retrospectively argue that that was unfair using an existing record, or that the manager who was conducting the exercise was biased in some way when they're just basing their scoring on existing records. Beware discriminatory selection criteria. That's sort of a health warning. The most common things that can be forgotten, possibly in haste or for other reasons, is on criteria like attendance records, where somebody might have a disability. And so to avoid that particular criteria being discriminatory against somebody who's been absent because of a disability, you should exclude disability-related absence. Similar analysis would be pregnancy-related absence. So that's one way of ensuring that if you had a criteria that was potentially discriminatory, you mitigate the advantage of anyone who could potentially be discriminated against in the way that you apply the criteria. Length of service, or sort of last in, first out. Lots of employers don't like it. I'm not a huge fan. The argument tends to be that it's discriminatory on the grounds of age. I'm never wholly convinced by that, because it depends which way you look at it in terms of whether you started young or how long you've worked there. But my general suggestion is, the law says that as part of a balanced criteria, there's nothing wrong with using length of service. When I'm advising clients, I like to often suggest it as a tiebreaker, possibly on the basis that length of service alone isn't usually a great indicator of who you necessarily want to keep, but all else being equal, it would be a sensible way to break the tie and reward loyalty. So that's discrimination criteria. The other example I had of where you can get into a bit of a tangle is if you have a, say, for example, a sales business, and one of the scoring categories is total sales. If you had a part-time employee, then you'd need to make adjustments to reflect that, because clearly a part-time employee's sales are going to be reduced from a full-time employee's, and to make the criteria fair, you'd have to operate some kind of prorating. Selection interviews or selection exercises, often with more senior positions, it's much harder to separate people using criteria, or whether or not someone's had 3 days of absence versus 2 days of absence is really business critical, and you'd much rather base it on wider skills. And there's nothing wrong, in the case law supports you having selection exercises, but the same principles apply about these being fair. So I would suggest that if you are doing interviews, for example, that you have the same interview for every candidate, the same questions, and that you're marking them against a model answer or against a scoring criteria, and the interviewers, ideally more than one, are making notes so that it can be shown why they got the scores, what differentiate between the candidates, because in the end of a dispute, that would ward off allegations of bias or unfairness. And as Laura said, and as we keep saying, I suppose it's a common thing for lawyers to say, record keeping is critical. In the event you face a dispute, usually the focus of an employee's dispute is the scoring was unfair, and the manager or managers who did the scoring need to give evidence. And if they're explaining to the tribunal, this is why I did it, and here's where I noted it down at the time, and here's my letter that explained it at the time, that's going to be a lot easier for them to do 9-12 months hence, when they've probably forgotten a lot of things. And secondly, it's going to be a lot more credible to an employment tribunal if it's all documented and written down at the time. So I'm going to pass back to Laura for the third and final element, alternative employment.
Thanks, James. So alternative employment, which we mentioned briefly earlier on, I know there have been some questions on this already. So the extent and the duration of the search here, it's important to make sure that you're continually updating any alternative employment or any vacancies you've got. So throughout the process, rather than the traps that people sometimes fall into is at the point that you make the redundancy announcement, these are the jobs that you've got, here's a list, go and have a look at it and just give it out to everybody. Keep that list being updated throughout the consultation. If you've got employees who are working notice, keep an eye on that during their notice period as well. So the sufficient information, again, covered that in a little bit of detail earlier. So it really is just about making sure that the employees know enough about the alternate roles that are available to them. So making sure they know where to find them, who they can talk to about the jobs, where the job descriptions are, if they've got questions on what kind of skills they need to do them, making sure that that is all available and that there is an open channel of dialogue on those. So the point on alternative employment being suitable. Now this one can sometimes cause some interesting questions and discussions during the consultation process, because what you as the employer think might be a suitable alternative employment might be a very different view from what the employee considers themselves to be suitable for, and what kind of skills and job roles that they would be able to fulfill. Again, and I know we keep saying it, and as James was saying, it's a very lawyery thing to do, but keep going back to that. It is a two-way dialogue. So consider anything that they come up with, have a look at what their strengths and weaknesses are, and what the kind of roles are that are available, and what they could be assigned to. Now, as the employer, you might want to be thinking, well, actually, we wouldn't want these kind of people to be doing this kind of role. Now, that is fine. You don't have to go to them and say, this is a suitable role, or we consider it to be suitable. Go and have a look at all of these. What you need to be doing is matching up the roles with people that you genuinely think can do the roles, and having that chat with them. The other thing that sometimes goes wrong here is that people will be offered a suitable alternative role. They decline their suitable alternative role, and then they decide that they have therefore resigned, not been made redundant. That is incorrect. If they decline the suitable alternative role that is offered to them, the redundancy process continues, and their employment ends and is terminated by reason of redundancy at the end of the process. The enhanced rights for employees on maternity leave, again, just one to have in the back of your mind. If you have anybody who is on maternity leave at the point that the redundancy consultations are going on and the process is being done, then there are some enhanced rights to that employee that's on maternity leave. And the interesting distinction is it doesn't apply to people who are pregnant. So that protected characteristic, it doesn't apply to, it only applies to employees on maternity leave. They have entitled to be offered a suitable alternative role above other people in the pool. So even if your employee on maternity leave is the lowest scorer of the pool, if there is an alternative role, then they are the person who is entitled to be offered that one first. But what it doesn't mean is that they are immediately removed from the redundancy pool and therefore not made redundant. It is nothing to do with if they can have their job or keep a job of the same kind. It is the alternative role point that is the important one. And then common issues, as we were just saying, you might have people who are not in work at the point that you're carrying out the consultation, which can be tricky. So you could have people that are on long-term sickness or on maternity leave, for example. And the key here is keeping the dialogue open and taking reasonable steps to get those people engaged in the discussions and the consultation. So it might be the things that you more often see with things like disability problems, where you're having to look at the reasonable steps you can take to make sure that they are engaged. So it would be going to the employees that are not in work and saying, how can we make this work for you? Could we do it via a Teams call? Could we do it by the phone call? Do you need it out of hours at a time that suits you? Do you need some extra time to read, etc.? So the real point here is the employment tribunal, and case law says this, will assess you on the fairness of what you actually did. So if you can show to the tribunal in evidence, if it was challenged, well, actually, we made every reasonable effort we could to get this person into a meeting. Look, we offered them various different dates, various methods of doing it, and that sort of chain that shows what steps you took, that is likely to be helpful. Where employees want to leave during consultation, so you may get someone who just says, well, actually, I want to go. I don't want to continue with this consultation. That needs to be considered. Our usual position is make them finish the consultation. So continue as you would do with getting them into the meetings as far as possible and follow the process all the way to the end. And this is to try and mitigate any risk at the end of the process where they say, well, it had all been decided, so I left halfway through. Now I know, and in our breakout room, we were discussing the point on voluntary redundancies. If you do have voluntary redundancies that come up, what we would normally recommend is, and again, that broken record of write it all down, having some sort of record that says that this person has understood that they're leaving throughout the process, that the process will not continue, they understand the terms on which they're going at that point, and that you've got that documentation that shows why that happened, because what you don't want at the end of it is somebody to say, well, I only asked if I could leave early. I just thought it was a nice thing to ask because I was a bit stressed. You want them to understand that actually you've had that conversation. They know that if they take the decision to go now, then that is what they're leaving on, and that's all agreed between you all. And then grievances raised during the process, again, a fairly common thing that can happen. And it really, really depends on what the subject matter of the grievance is. So if it's something to do with the redundancy process, so they've come and raised a grievance and said, my scoring is unfair, then it is more appropriate to deal with that as part of the redundancy consultation in the normal way of having that chat. If it is something that is potentially completely separate, so you suddenly get a 5-page letter that says that there's been a whole load of terrible things happening for 3 years and these various people have done X, Y, and Z, you'll probably take the view that it's more appropriate to consider that separately to the process for the redundancy process. So have a grievance process for that and a redundancy process for their consultation. It doesn't always mean that you have to put it on hold. Again, that is very subject matter specific. So if there is a reason that you need to put it on hold, as in the grievance they've raised is against the person who did the scoring, potentially you do need to put it on hold, or you need to have a chat about how that's going to work together. But if it's completely separate, it is fine to run 2 concurrent processes. I will hand back over to James.
Thanks, Laura. I remember to turn the mic back on. Restructuring. So restructuring isn't really a legally defined term, but in the context of today, I'm just going to talk about things where it isn't a redundancy situation, but you're making changes, usually to optimize an employer's workforce. And usually that involves changing terms and conditions. And I've put on the slide 3 different examples. I'm going to counterintuitively work up from number 3, place of work change. As I sort of alluded to right at the start with the redundancy situation examples, there could be a potential redundancy situation with the place of work. But some of you, when you were voting, might have thought about this and it might have influenced your answer. And you may well have been right. It's a very narrow example. A lot of employment contracts will have a mobility clause. And insofar as you have a contractual right to move the employee from premises A to premises B, then if you don't need them at premises A, but you need them at premise B, and that's within the context of their employment contract, then you wouldn't have a redundancy situation because you would have the contractual right to remove them. or move them from one location to another, subject to the clause. All I would say about exercising contractual clauses like mobility clauses in particular is you have to bear in mind the implied term in all employment contracts of trust and confidence, and that in that context would require you to act reasonably in seeking to invoke the mobility clause. So fairly straightforward stuff, giving people reasonable notice of the change and considering whether or not there's anything you need to do to support. I don't know whether it's assist with transportation or parking, or even that's only on a temporary measure. I'm not suggesting you need to do any of those things, but you might, depending on the context of the move, there might be things you ought to consider to act reasonably. It depends on what the nature of the change is. So place of work can be an interesting one because it can be something you can do just by contractual rights. It could be something that could be easily agreed, or it could be something that plausibly is a redundancy situation. The other two, the first two bullet points, similar context, hours of work or shift patterns, changing terms relating to pay. If we presume that we can't just change them as a contractual right, and certainly with pay, I mean, any clause that seeks to be able to unilaterally change the employee's pay downwards by an employer, I'd suggest is unlikely to be enforceable. And similarly, you could have a clause that has flexibility of shift patterns, but it would have to be pretty explicit to be enforceable. Especially if you had somebody who's on a sort of standard type contract where it said it's 9 till 5 and now you're introducing shifts, it's unlikely you're going to be able to just make changes. So how do we go about doing that? Well, it's very similar to the redundancy context in that you would need to consult with employees. The big difference, I suppose, with this and a redundancy type scenario is here, because you're trying to change terms, the goal should just be agreeing. In a redundancy context, it's going to be extremely difficult to agree that there's a redundancy situation or that somebody has been selected for redundancy and you aren't really expected to. But with changing terms, the goal is to agree. But the same method would be used to do that. So you would hold a meeting, you would discuss what it is you're trying to agree, why it is you're trying to agree it, you would seek the employee's input, and you would hopefully ideally get to a point of common ground. Not always possible, depending on the nature of the change, but if you were going to dismiss if agreement couldn't be reached, you would have been expected to consult first before you got to the position where you thought you needed to dismiss. That would be somewhat of a last resort where agreement couldn't be reached. Which leads on to my next slide. If you were to get to a situation where you were trying to agree change to terms and conditions, whether that's shift patterns, reduction in pay, whatever it was, if you were to saturate that consultation and an employee didn't agree, and you decided that it was something that the employer wanted to go ahead with, you could serve notice on the employee in the same way you would in a redundancy context by giving them whatever their contractual notice was. The big difference would be, instead of receiving a redundancy payment, in order to be fair, you would normally offer them re-engagement, I used the wrong term, re-engagement on the basis of the terms they wouldn't agree, or what you would be prepared to agree on, to take effect immediately after their contract came to an end. And so if they were to accept it, their continuity of service would be unimpacted. They would just carry on, but on the new terms. In the event that they didn't agree to that re-engagement, and you did get to this end point of dismissing, from a unfair dismissal perspective, your reason for dismissal as the employer would not be redundancy. In this case, it would come under the much quoted but often misunderstood catch-all of some other substantial reason, because there is a line of cases where it's clearly set out that a failure to agree changes to terms and conditions can be some other substantial reason, the reason being that they wouldn't agree to the new terms. Burden isn't actually that high on the employer to fall within that some other substantial reason exemption. You just have to say there was a genuine business reason that you wanted to proceed with the change. You wouldn't have to show, for example, in a financial context that the business was in some kind of financial peril, and that if you didn't change it, there'd be serious consequences. The bar isn't that high to establish the reason. But in assessing whether it actually was or wasn't reasonable to dismiss assuming you've offered, well, assuming you've offered re-engagement, but it would be a negative from your case and reasonableness if you hadn't. The slide lists factors a tribunal would take into account in assessing whether or not dismissal for failing to agree new terms was fair or unfair. So the motive for the changes, I've briefly covered that. Are there genuine business reasons for that change? Why the employee wouldn't agree is relevant. Whether the majority agreed is relevant. So if you were doing this across the board and there was 40 employees and 38 of them agreed, then the 2 that didn't agree would find it much more difficult to succeed with an unfair dismissal claim. Whether there was genuine meaningful consultation, so similar to the redundancy context, as I said, and have alternatives been considered? So was the consultation undertook reasonably? If you're negotiating on things like pay and conditions, then what would be positive from an employer's perspective is if you could show that you started out in one position and your final offer that they still didn't accept was actually more favourable, that you genuinely engaged during that consultation process. So slightly different considerations if you do get to the point of having to dismiss in a context of not being able to agree changes as part of a restructure to bear in mind. And the final point on the slide is statutory code on fire and rehire. I mean, it's a bit of a crude term, fire and rehire, but I suppose that is what is envisaged by the scenario I was just describing, where you go into consultation about changing terms and conditions and you don't agree and you fire and offer to rehire, more technically described as dismiss and offer re-engagement. Sounds a lot nicer than fire and rehire. Apparently there's going to be a statutory code. Now, I'd struggle to see how this statutory code, given that it's only going to be a code and not legislation, is going to change any of the case law that I've just outlined. It might just codify it and set out these points in a code that an employment tribunal would consider when analysing the fairness of what an employer had done. And the one irony of the fire and rehire statutory code is that the idea for it seemed to have come about from the P&O situation. When there wasn't a fire and rehire, there was just fire and no rehire, because the rehiring was of other people in a different country. It wasn't suggesting they were going to rehire the staff they'd actually fired, which is what the code would cover. So it's a slightly odd one there. Final 2 slides are on collective consultation. As I said at the start, I'm not going to go into all the details of something that's quite a technical process, not necessarily that complicated as such. It just requires detail and planning to make sure you get it right. For the purposes there, I just want to flag it so that you're aware of it in case it is relevant and you need to dig into that detail. So when does the duty to collectively consult arise? It arises where an employer is proposing to dismiss as redundant 20 or more employees at a single establishment within a period of 90 days or less. Now, establishment is subject to quite a lot of case law. Generally speaking, and there are exceptions to this, this would be a site or a place of work. There may be scenarios where you could argue that an establishment is wider than that, but that would be the general rule of thumb. The 90 days or less is when the dismissals take effect. So essentially, you need to be looking at how many people are being dismissed within a 90-day period. If 45 people are being dismissed at the end of January and another 45 at the beginning of March, then that's 90 people being dismissed across a 90-day period. So that would trigger the obligation. If it was 10 and 10, it would still trigger the obligation. So it's worth bearing in mind that that 90 period is time where you look at the number of dismissals. And so what I'd say there is, whilst you can plan your restructure with this in mind, the law is very, very wise to employers seeking to avoid this obligation by staggering dismissals. So if you were proposing now to dismiss more than 20 people, but you thought we'll just do 10 now and we'll do another 10 in just after the 90-day period, is that the law might consider that to be an avoidance process, and that you really were proposing all along to dismiss them in the short period of time. So you need to be a bit careful on avoidance there, but it's where they're 20 or more, that's when you really start to think about it. And one thing that can catch people out is the wider definition of redundancy under the Trade Union and Labour Relations Consolidation Act. Slightly unhelpfully that the two acts have different definitions of redundancy. I've put the definition on the slide, it's where the dismissal is not related to the individual concerned, or for a number of reasons, all of which are not so related. What that basically means is reasons that aren't specific to the individual. So reasons specific to an individual would be things like ill health, misconduct, breakdown in relations. If it's to do with business-wide factors like traditional redundancy that we talked about at the start, or because people couldn't agree changes to terms and conditions. So if you were proposing to dismiss 100 workers if they didn't agree to the new shift patterns, then that would trigger the obligation to collectively consult under the Trade Union Labour Relations Act. There can be a slight tension when you're proposing to agree changes to terms, because an employer could say, in one scenario, they weren't proposing to dismiss anyone, they wanted to agree the changes, and in another scenario, they were not proposing to dismiss anyone if at all possible, but they were contemplating that if they couldn't agree the changes. So you have to consider whether or not you were, or whether you are or aren't going to follow through and consider dismissal and re-engagement if changes can't be agreed at the beginning of your process, to tell you whether or not you need to comply with the collective consultation obligations. The problem if you don't decide that you are proposing to dismiss and then you change your mind is that you might then have to start collectively consulting when you decide actually you do want to dismiss and re-engage, and then that might set you back on your timeline because you have to wait for the statutory consultation periods that are a bit longer to expire. That's 30 days if it's 20 or more, 45 now if it was 100 or more. So there's some planning to be done there as to whether you do or don't, even as just a safeguard in the hope that you never need to dismiss anyone, go through a collective consultation exercise. As I said, consider at planning stage. Why have I mentioned this today? Why is it important? Well, primarily because of the risk of a protective award. A protective award is an award that's made against an employer where they fail to comply with the duty to consult under the Trade Union Labour Relations Act. And it is an amount of 90 days gross pay per affected employee. So that's somebody who was affected by the duty to consult and who you failed to consult with. And as you can imagine, 90 days gross pay for at least 20 employees is going to be a fairly big number. So it's why it's always one to be aware of. And as I said, there's a number of additional obligations with collectively consulting under that Act. Primarily, it's the minimum consultation period that you have to go through before any dismissals are allowed to take effect, which is either 30 or 45 days. You also have to notify the Secretary of State on the form HR1 that some of you will have no doubt filled in. And there are various other things you need to do in respect of giving information to appropriate representatives, which may or may not be trade unions, depending on their involvement, or elected representatives in holding elections. But as I said, if we were going to do that now, we would run over time. So that is possibly a topic for another day. Hopefully not, because it's one thing that hopefully not many people have to go through. So that brings us to a close. I can see in the chat we've had a question about bumping, and Nick has been, I did add a little comment, Nick's been busy at work answering that one. I think people were a bit alarmed about bumping, and I think Nick's probably reassured you that it's sort of the exception to the rule, and it wouldn't just be the case that the poor person who was considered being bumped is just immediately sacked. Well, if they were, that'd almost certainly be unfair. It's more a case of bumping then sets off a chain of events of widening the pool and extending consultation. And so it's something that's probably best avoided. And to go back to Laura's point is, if you consider it at the beginning, chances are from the way you've done the pooling is you're not going to be in favour of bumping, because otherwise you'd have considered it as part of the original proposal. But there might be exceptions to that. So it's usually something to just be mindful of, is think if you put yourself in the shoes of the potentially redundant employees in your chosen pool, are they likely or not to say, ooh, I could do this other job held by this other employee? And if they are, you might want to be sort of forewarned or forearmed with what you might say if they brought that up in consultation as to why or not you did or didn't consider that as a possibility. So it's more of a planning piece rather than a go down a rabbit hole of changing the whole process halfway through and bumping and widening pools and end up upsetting lots of people and having a massively elongated consultation exercise. There's nothing else in the chat. I mean, you could, if anyone was brave enough, they wanted to ask directly, then feel free. If not, thank you all very much for attending.
Thank you, everybody. Again, well done, James and Laura. That was a really useful session, prompted lots of discussion in the groups as well, which was really helpful. We hope you've enjoyed it. If you do need any further advice, obviously, we'd be really happy to help, and you can get in touch. But I think we'll call it a day. Enjoy the rest of your week. Thanks, everyone.